Picture a cold gray morning in a vast medieval castle, its stone walls thick with shadows and secrets. A 6-year-old girl stands in a dim chamber, the chill seeping into her thin silk dress. Outside, heavy wooden doors creak open, heralding a visitor whose presence will forever change the course of her life. The air is heavy with the scent of burning wood and damp earth, but inside the castle, a far darker weight presses on her small shoulders. This girl is no ordinary child. She is a pawn in a deadly game of power and politics, betrothed to a man more than 4 times her age, a king who rules not with kindness, but with iron and ambition. Her childhood is being swallowed by alliances forged in cold calculation, her innocence traded for crowns and castles. This is the forgotten queen, whose name history barely whispers, yet whose story reveals the brutal sacrifices behind the grand chessboard of medieval monarchy. From stolen childhood to the storm of court intrigue and survival against overwhelming odds, her life paints a vivid portrait of what it meant to be both royal and utterly powerless. Before we journey into her world of grandeur and cruelty, if you crave stories where history's untold voices rise from the shadows, hit that like button, subscribe, and join me as we unravel the tragic fate of the Queen married at 6. The dawn broke pale and muted over the sprawling stone fortress known as Blackthorn Keep. Mist curled like ghostly fingers across the frozen moat, shrouding the turrets in an eerie veil. Inside the great hall, the flicker of torches cast wavering shadows on cold, worn tapestries. Scenes of battles long past, heroes now forgotten. In a small chamber tucked away from the court's clamor, a 6-year-old girl named Eleanor sat by a narrow window. Her pale fingers traced the delicate embroidery on her silk gown, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of confusion and quiet fear. The walls echoed with distant footsteps, the heralds of a change she did not yet understand. Today, her life would be claimed by a promise she never made. Eleanor was born to a minor noble family, gentlefolk who held lands by the grace of their loyalty to the crown. She had known a childhood of simple pleasures, chasing butterflies in sun-dappled gardens, listening to the old steward's stories by the hearth, the warm embrace of her mother's arms at night. But all that innocence was about to shatter beneath the weight of a royal bargain. At the heart of medieval politics was a harsh truth. Children were pawns. Marriages were contracts, alliances forged not by love, but by power. And Eleanor's destiny was no exception. For years, her father had negotiated with the crown, seeking favor and protection in turbulent times. In return, he agreed to bind his daughter's fate to the throne, to be married, not to a boy her own age, but to King Richard II himself, a man of 29 winters, whose rule was as cold and distant as the northern winds that howled through the castle battlements. The court was a place of whispers and watchful eyes. Lords and ladies, cloaked in silks and jewels, moved like shadows through corridors lined with stone gargoyles that seemed to leer down upon them. Eleanor's arrival was awaited not with joy, but with calculation. The king, a ruler marked by his stoic demeanor and iron will, saw her not as a child, but as a symbol, a living treaty to secure loyalty from her family's lands. Her attendants prepared her meticulously. The finest gowns were draped over her slender frame, golden ribbons woven through her dark hair. But no richness could mask the stark reality. A 6-year-old was being groomed to enter a world of grown men, political intrigue, and unforgiving expectations. The moment came as the great oaken doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant groan. Eleanor was led forward, her small hands clutching the hem of her dress. The king sat upon his throne, a towering figure clad in crimson and ermine, his gaze steady and unreadable. Around him, nobles and courtiers watched in silence. The marriage was less ceremony and more decree. No vows of love, no promises whispered in tender tones, only the cold language of law and power. Eleanor's name was sealed into history that day, not as a girl with dreams and fears, but as a queen in waiting, bound by duty before she had even learned to read. Behind the throne, the faces of Eleanor's family were masks of pride and despair. Her mother's eyes glistened with tears, swallowed quickly behind a tight smile. Her father's jaw was set hard, knowing the price they had paid for survival. For them, this alliance meant protection. For Eleanor, it meant a childhood surrendered to the ambitions of men. Days blurred into weeks as Eleanor was drawn deeper into the relentless machinery of court life. She learned to keep her voice quiet, her gaze downcast. The tutors who arrived spoke in stern tones about protocol, languages, and religion. Playtime became lessons in etiquette. Laughter was replaced by the echo of harsh commands. Even the castle's walls seemed to conspire against her, cold and unyielding as stone. Nights were the hardest, the silence broken only by the distant howling of wolves and the muffled footsteps of guards patrolling the battlements. She clung to the fragile hope that someday, perhaps, she might reclaim a fragment of her stolen childhood. Yet, the shadows of court were never far behind. Rumors swirled like autumn leaves in a gale. Whispers spoke of the king's mercurial temper, of his ruthless dealings with enemies, of alliances forged in blood and fear. Eleanor was a queen in name, but a child in a cage of political power. As the weeks passed, the gap between Eleanor and her husband widened like a chasm. The king, preoccupied with wars and council disputes, rarely looked upon her with anything but distant formality. His world was one of steel and strategy, while hers was confined to silent halls and shadowed corners. And yet, fate had other designs. For within the stone walls of Blackthorn Keep, secrets stirred, plots woven by those who saw the child queen as a threat or a tool. As Eleanor's presence grew, so did the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of courtly life, threatening to engulf her in a tempest far beyond her years. The game had only just begun. The cold stone corridors of Blackthorn Keep swallowed Eleanor's footsteps as she was led away from the throne room that had marked her transformation from child to queen. The echoes of the great hall, the rustle of silk, the weighty silence, the invisible eyes watching, lingered behind her like a shadow she could never shake. In the days that followed, the castle became both prison and fortress. Eleanor's world shrank to a labyrinth of chambers, tutors, and court rituals that left little space for childhood dreams. Her days began with the harsh clang of the great bell, the sound cutting through the still morning air like a herald of duty rather than hope. Her tutors were stern men and women, chosen not for kindness but for their ability to mold the girl into a symbol of regal perfection. They drilled her in Latin prayers, royal protocol, and the delicate art of bowing without faltering. The court demanded poise and silence, two things a 6-year-old was yet to master. "Do not fidget," the lady-in-waiting would whisper sharply whenever Eleanor's restless fingers twisted the hem of her gown. "You are a queen now. Even in your smallest movements, you must command respect. Respect. A word heavy with expectation. Eleanor soon learned it was less about admiration and more about submission. By the time she was 8, the court was already buzzing with rumors. Whispered warnings of enemies at the king's back, nobles plotting in shadowed corners, and alliances shifting like quicksand. Her presence, though small and silent, was part of the chessboard. Every smile she offered, every word she was allowed to speak, was watched and measured. The king remained a distant figure, more a monarch of stone than a father of warmth. His eyes rarely met hers, except in the most formal of occasions. When they did, the glance was brief, measured, a reminder that she was at peace to be moved, not a person to be cherished. Eleanor found solace in the quiet moments, stolen between the endless lessons and the oppressive gaze of the court. She would slip away to the castle gardens when the guards, patrols, shifted, where the scent of blooming lavender mingled with the crisp air. Here, surrounded by ancient oaks and murmuring fountains, she could almost pretend she was still a child, free to laugh, to dream, to simply be. But those moments were fleeting, broken by the relentless demands of her station. One afternoon, as the sun filtered weakly through the stained glass windows of the chapel, Eleanor knelt in prayer, her small hands clasped tightly. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the weariness behind her youthful eyes. "God," she whispered, voice trembling, "give me strength to bear what is asked of me." Her prayers were not just for herself, but for a future she could barely envision, a future where she might one day hold power not granted by marriage or birthright, but earned by her own hand. The court was a crucible, and Eleanor was its delicate flame, flickering in the winds of ambition and betrayal. Political tension simmered beneath the surface like a dark storm waiting to break. The king's enemies whispered of rebellion, his advisors jockeyed for influence, and the fragile peace of the realm was always on the edge of fracture. Eleanor's family, once minor nobles, found themselves thrust into the eye of the storm. Her father, a man hardened by years of political maneuvering, struggled to maintain favor with the king. Letters arrived at the keep, some bearing the king's seal, others threatening consequences veiled in courtly language. Every message was a reminder that their lives and fortunes depended on their loyalty to the crown. The queen's role was not merely symbolic. She was a living bond, a promise of alliance, and a target for those who would see the fragile order topple. One cold evening, as the wind howled outside the castle walls, a shadow slipped through the dimly lit corridors. A servant whispered to Eleanor's chamber door, delivering a message wrapped in secrecy. The note was brief but chilling. "Watch the ones closest to you. Trust is the deadliest poison." Fear settled in Eleanor's chest like a stone. The dangers of court were no longer distant rumors. They were real, immediate threats, lurking in every smile and whispered word. Yet, amid the tension, there were rare flickers of kindness. A gentle nursemaid who hummed lullabies in the quiet hours. An elderly scribe who taught Eleanor to write her own name with careful patience. Small acts of humanity that stitched fragile patches of hope into the fabric of her constrained life. But these moments were fragile, and Eleanor knew they could be torn away as swiftly as they came. As she approached her 10th birthday, the weight of her future pressed down with growing force. The king's counselors spoke in hushed tones of an impending alliance, one that would require Eleanor to embrace her role fully, not as a child, but as a queen ready to cement the fragile power of the throne. For Eleanor, the path ahead was fraught with peril and promise. She was a child caught between innocence and obligation, love and betrayal, light and shadow. And the court's game was only just beginning. Years slipped by like whispers through the stone walls of Blackthorn Keep. Eleanor grew taller, her once childlike face maturing into the pale, composed countenance of a young woman, shaped by duty and silence. The innocence stolen from her at 6 had long since been buried beneath layers of courtly expectation and cold calculation. Her wedding, a ceremony that had sealed her fate as a child, was now a memory wrapped in velvet and shadow. At 13, Eleanor was no longer merely a pawn. She was expected to become a queen who could command loyalty and navigate the dangerous currents swirling around the throne. Yet, the gulf between Eleanor and King Richard II remained vast, bridged only by the formality of their union and the unspoken loneliness that haunted both. Richard was a man consumed by the weight of his crown, his features etched with weariness from endless wars, betrayals, and the ceaseless demands of rule. Their marriage was political theater, a carefully staged dance performed before a court that watched and waited. Richard's gaze rarely softened, and Eleanor's smiles were practiced, her voice tempered into the measured tones of a diplomat rather than a child or a wife. The royal bedchambers, though lavishly adorned with tapestries and silken drapes, held no warmth. They were a place of duty rather than desire, where Eleanor learned the harsh lessons of expectation without affection. The king's attention was fleeting, his concern often diverted by council disputes or military campaigns. But beneath the austere veneer of court life, the realm trembled. Political factions shifted like sand dunes, and enemies lurked behind every smile. Nobles jostled for favor, whispering poison into eager ears, while the king's advisors plotted their next moves in the endless game of power. Eleanor watched and learned. In the quiet hours, when the castle was wrapped in darkness, she pored over letters and records, seeking understanding of the fragile balance holding the kingdom together. She absorbed lessons on diplomacy, law, and the subtle art of influence, knowledge that might one day save her from being merely a figurehead. The chamberlain, a grizzled old man named Sir Edmund, became an unlikely mentor. With gruff patience, he taught Eleanor the unwritten rules of the court, who to trust, who to avoid, and when to speak, and when to remain silent. In this world, girl, he warned, words can be weapons sharper than any sword. Eleanor's childhood playthings had long been replaced by scrolls and quills, her days filled with lessons that weighed heavy on her small shoulders. She learned the language of power, of alliances sealed by marriage, treaties signed in blood, and betrayals whispered behind closed doors. Yet even in this world of shadows, she clung to fleeting moments of tenderness. The gentle smiles of the castle nursemaid, the whispered prayers of the chapel's priest, the soft glow of candlelight that flickered as she read her favorite poems by the hearth. But those moments were fragile as glass. One cold winter's night, a secret meeting was held in the king's private chambers. Eleanor was summoned, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a definitive thud. Around the fire, shadows danced on stone walls, and faces she barely recognized turned toward her with guarded eyes. The king's advisors spoke in hushed tones of rebellion brewing in the northern territories, of rival lords preparing to challenge Richard's rule. The fragile peace they had maintained was fracturing, and the weight of the coming storm rested heavily on all. Eleanor listened intently as they debated strategies, alliances to be forged, enemies to be subdued, marriages to be arranged. Her own hand was part of this grand design, a living bond to be offered as a promise of peace or a tool of war. As the meeting concluded, the king turned to Eleanor with a rare flash of something unreadable, perhaps hope or desperation. "You must be strong, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Our future depends on you." Those words echoed in her mind long after she left the chamber. Strength was no longer an option, it was a necessity. Days later, Eleanor received news that shattered what little innocence remained. A letter, sealed with the mark of a powerful northern lord, arrived bearing a marriage proposal. Not for her, but for her younger sister, meant to secure an alliance against rebellion. Eleanor's heart clenched. She understood all too well the price of power, the sacrifice of family, the betrayal of blood. Yet she steeled herself, knowing her own path was no different. In the court's endless dance, Eleanor began to wield her growing influence with quiet determination. She hosted gatherings in the castle's smaller chambers, inviting nobles and envoys under the guise of courtly hospitality. There, behind silken curtains and flickering candlelight, she learned the art of negotiation, the careful choice of words, the subtle shift of alliances. Her youth was both a shield and a weapon. Nobles underestimated her, dismissing the child queen as a harmless figurehead. But Eleanor listened. She observed. And she waited. The threat of rebellion grew nearer, casting long shadows across the realm. And as the court braced for the coming storm, Eleanor knew that her survival, and the survival of the kingdom, depended on mastering the delicate balance between trust and suspicion, loyalty and betrayal. She was no longer a frightened child led to a throne. She was a queen, forged in shadows, ready to face the storm. The chill of early spring seeped into Blackthorn Keep's thick stone walls, carrying with it the heavy scent of damp earth and distant rain. Outside, the castle's banners flapped listlessly against a slate-gray sky, mirroring the uneasy calm that gripped the kingdom within. Eleanor stood by a narrow window in her chamber, gazing out at the mist-shrouded gardens where once she had chased butterflies as a carefree child. Now those memories felt like fragments from another life, a life swallowed by the demands of the crown and the merciless game of power she was forced to play. The storm that had been brewing across the realm was no longer a whisper, but a gathering tempest. Northern lords, emboldened by discontent and promises of freedom, stirred rebellion. The king's advisors were divided. Some urged brutal suppression, others counseled cautious diplomacy. Caught between factions, Eleanor sensed the shifting loyalties like a hawk sensing the wind's direction. Trust was a fragile thing here, often broken like thin ice beneath heavy feet. One evening, as the flickering candlelight painted her chamber in golden hues, a messenger arrived with a letter sealed in black wax, the mark of a traitor. With trembling hands, Eleanor broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The words within chilled her blood. A plot was unfolding against the king, spearheaded by a trusted noble, someone who walked the halls of Blackthorn, Keep with the king's blessing, yet harbored venomous ambitions beneath a mask of loyalty. The betrayal cut deep. Eleanor realized that in the court's tangled web, enemies were often closest to the throne. Determined to protect the fragile peace and the king she served, Eleanor resolved to act. She called upon Sir Edmund, her loyal chamberlain, and shared the secret she had uncovered. Together they devised a plan, subtle, cautious, and dangerous. They would gather proof, catch the traitor unawares, and bring the conspiracy to light before the kingdom plunged into chaos. The days that followed were a tense dance of shadows. Eleanor moved with newfound purpose, meeting in secret with trusted allies, her youthful face masking a sharp mind honed by years of survival. Whispers filled the corridors. Eyes watched from behind tapestries. Every step was measured, every word weighed. One cold night, under the cover of darkness, Eleanor slipped through the castle's hidden passages to a concealed chamber where conspirators met in secret. Her heart pounded like a war drum as she listened to their hushed voices, plotting rebellion and treason. The faces she recognized, friends turned foes, trusted lords whose ambition blinded them to loyalty. With proof secured, Eleanor returned to the king's side, delivering the evidence that would save his reign and her own. The king, though fierce and imposing, showed a rare glimmer of gratitude. "You are more than a queen," he said quietly. "You are the kingdom's shield." But the victory was bittersweet. The betrayal left scars deeper than any wound. Eleanor understood that trust was a currency too precious to spend lightly. In the cruel world of court politics, survival demanded vigilance and sacrifice. As the rebellion was quelled and the kingdom steadied, Eleanor's role evolved. No longer just a symbol, she became a player in the high-stakes game of power. She negotiated alliances, managed estates, and served as the king's voice in his absence. Her childhood lost, she forged herself into a queen of strength and resilience. Yet, even amid triumph, the price was high. Eleanor's body and spirit bore the toll of years spent in the crucible of queenship. The loneliness, the betrayals, and the constant shadow of danger. She learned to wear her crown not just on her head, but in her heart, a heavy burden carried with quiet dignity. And through it all, she held on to a fragile hope that one day her sacrifices would secure a future where children might live free of the shadows that had defined her own life. Years passed like leaves on a restless wind, carrying Eleanor from the fragile girl who stood trembling before a throne to the woman who shaped kingdoms in silence. Blackthorn Keep had seen seasons change, witnessed the rise and fall of courtiers, and heard the whispered prayers of a queen who had learned to wield power with quiet, unyielding strength. The kingdom itself was scarred by wars and alliances, betrayals, and fragile treaties. The throne that had once seemed a distant, cold seat was now hers to protect, not merely with armies or steel, but with wisdom born of sacrifice. Eleanor's life had been a tapestry woven from threads of pain and perseverance. The childhood stolen, the loneliness endured, and the battles fought in chambers as much as on fields had forged her into a ruler few dared to challenge. Her influence spread like roots beneath the surface of the court. She counseled kings and nobles, brokered marriages that preserved peace, and nurtured the future through careful stewardship of lands and people. Yet, her own story remained veiled behind the curtain of history, known to few and celebrated by none. In the quiet moments, Eleanor often retreated to the gardens of her youth, now transformed by the hands of gardeners who tended roses and herbs with patient care. Here, amid blooming petals and soft sunlight, she allowed herself memories, both bitter and sweet. She thought of the little girl who once chased butterflies in these very gardens, whose laughter was silenced by duty and fear. That child was gone, yet her spirit lingered, a silent companion to the queen who had survived storms both within and without. But history, as it often does, chose to forget the fragile figures who carried its weight in silence. Eleanor's name faded from the chronicles, replaced by kings and battles, triumphs and tragedies that made grander stories. Yet her legacy lived on, not in statues or songs, but in the fragile peace that held the realm together, in the heirs she nurtured who would one day rule, and in the quiet strength passed down through generations. One crisp autumn evening, as amber leaves drifted lazily through the castle courtyard, Eleanor sat beside the hearth in her private chamber. The flickering firelight danced across her weathered face, illuminating eyes that held the wisdom of a lifetime. A young noblewoman entered, carrying a letter sealed with the king's emblem. Eleanor took it with a faint smile, recognizing the endless cycle of duty continuing beyond her own years. "Your wisdom guides us still, my lady," the woman said softly, bowing her head. Eleanor nodded, her voice steady but gentle. "A queen's strength is not in the crown she wears, but in the sacrifices she makes." As the night deepened, Eleanor gazed once more toward the garden window. The world outside was vast and uncertain, but within her heart burned a quiet hope that the shadows of her past might give way to a future brightened by peace and understanding. And so, the Forgotten Queen's story whispered through time, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit amid the relentless tides of history. In the grand halls of history, her name may have been whispered only in passing, a footnote beneath the towering legacies of kings and conquerors. Yet, Eleanor's life tells a story far greater than titles or battles. She was the girl robbed of childhood, the queen forged in shadows, the woman who bore the heavy crown of survival with quiet dignity. Her strength was not in loud triumphs, but in the silent endurance of a life shaped by sacrifice. Behind every alliance sealed, every fragile peace brokered, her presence lingered, a testament to the unseen hands that hold the fragile threads of power together. Eleanor's story reminds us that history is not just written by the victors who command armies, but by those who navigate darkness with grace, who wield influence without fanfare, and who survive when all else seems lost. The Forgotten Queen's legacy lives on in every whispered hope, every quiet act of resilience, and every soul who finds strength in the shadows. Her crown was invisible to most, but its weight was no less real, a silent symbol of courage that time cannot erase.